Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is April 16th, 2013, and my guest is James Galbraith of the University of Texas. His latest book is Inequality and Instability. James, welcome to EconTalk.
Good to be with you.
Before I get started, I want to mention I recently hosted an event at Butler University that was co-sponsored with Liberty Fund. The event was called Capitalism, Government, and the Good Society. Richard Epstein, Mike Munger, and Robert Skidelsky spoke on the topic, and then I moderated a conversation between the three of them. Today's guest, James Galbraith, was supposed to make that a quartet, but weather intervened, and he wasn't able to arrive in time for the program. There will be a very nice video of the event produced by John Popola. When it's available, we'll put up a notice at the EconTalk homepage, and I'll tweet on it. I remind you that you can follow me on Twitter at EconTalker, EconTalker, and we may get an EconTalk podcast out of it. But in the meanwhile, I'm happy to have scheduled this interview with James Galbraith so that listeners can get a sense of his worldview. So let's get started. Our topic today is inequality, but we're going to get into some other issues as well. Now, James, you have a very different view on the topic compared to either what I would call the mainstream view on the left or the right. Many on the left argue inequality is partly caused by a lack of progress by the median worker since the 1970s. The average person's been left behind, and so it's not just inequality that we need to worry about, it's stagnation. On the right, when we talk about inequality, the argument you often hear is that, and this is certainly a common view among many economists, left and right, that the growth in inequality over time is due to technological change, differences in productivity that have been biased against low education, low skilled workers. Now, what's wrong with those arguments in your opinion?
I think in particularly the case of the second, they start from a hypothesis which was framed before there was any factual foundation or body of evidence against which one could judge it. The way you've characterized the first position, it's really not about inequality at all, but rather tying up the term into a larger set of concerns about the stagnation of wage growth. And I think that's a substantially different set of issues. My approach, how does my approach differ? I've been working on this for between 15 and 20 years. And from the beginning, I realized that if you wanted to speak sensibly about the subject, you had to enrich the available body of measurement in order to be able to get a clearer picture of what's been going on both in the United States and the wider world. And that's been the foundation of now 3 books on the topic, of which Inequality and Stability is the latest.
Well, let's take each of those claims of the left and right, and I certainly agree with you that the claim I attributed to the left does conflate inequality with what you might call middle-class progress or middle-class prosperity or the middle-class period. But I think in our debate as a nation out in the world, I hear that all the time. Those issues do get mixed together, and I think it's unfortunate because I think they are two different issues, but they do get mixed together. So let's start with this argument about technological change. It seems reasonable. We see, if we look at the growth of, say, income over time, measured by college or lack of college or high school diploma or no diploma, but some high school, there are large differences in the growth rates over time in those numbers. Why do you think that those are not important? Or do you think those are important? Or are those numbers wrong?
I think the mistake comes from beginning the analysis by dividing up your sample population according to the reported educational credential, and then treating those groups as the primary units of analysis. Fundamentally, that's not going to tell you if it turns out that something else was decisive in differentiating incomes of people who happen to have these different educational credentials, this approach to the analysis is not going to allow you to discern that. And it turns out that if you start with a much more eclectic approach to the primary information set, to the classification, you can distinguish the things that are important from things that aren't. And there simply isn't any evidence that inequality is being driven by educational status as such. Clearly, it's quite possible, indeed the case, that people with higher level educational credentials also tend to be people who have access to kinds of employment and to kinds of asset holdings, which will lead them to have very rapidly growing incomes and be the beneficiaries be on the winning end of a rise in measured inequality. But it's that's a far cry from saying that this is in some sense causally related to their educational status. It's not.
So you're arguing that let me stick with the standard argument for a minute. The standard argument is that as globalization has increased and as technological change has encouraged the information economy, people with high levels of education are particularly benefited by that move toward the information economy. People at the low end of the education distribution are competing because of globalization with low-wage workers outside the United States, so they have trouble sustaining any wage growth. The high end is benefiting from the increased demand for their services, and that I would say is the standard economist view. I have my own issues with it, but what
that view has been in circulation since the early 1990s, when it was advanced in a very prominent article in the American Economic Review. And at that time, as I said, the evidentiary foundation for it was practically nil. What you had were some surveys at widely disparate times showing that that income inequality had increased between the 70s and the late 80s, for example. And it was very hard to know. First of all, this is data restricted only to the United States, so it's a very, from the larger standpoint of economic analysis, kind of provincial perspective. But secondly, given that the information set was so limited, you really couldn't tell when the increase in inequality had occurred specifically, or link it to the changes in the structure of the American economy over the course of the 70s and 80s. So what I did in the first book that I did on this, which was a book called Created Unequal, The Crisis in American Pay, that appeared in 1998, was to construct new inequality measures based upon data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Employment and Earnings data sets, which enabled one to basically track out the rise of inequality in pay structures on a year-to-year basis. And it became very clear from that the rise in inequality was a temporarily limited phenomenon, that things had been driven up very dramatically by the recessions of the early 1980s, that what people who lived through that period knew to be the dominant fact of the time, which was that a lot of well-paid blue-collar workers were losing their jobs, was in fact the thing that's most closely associated with rising inequality in the wage structure. And that's clearly it's a deep stretch to link that to educational status. And the fact was that there were well-paid unionized jobs all across the American Midwest that got wiped out in the surge of, first of all, in the recession and the surge of globalized trade that followed it. But mainly it was the recession of the early 1980s that you can see very clearly in the data.
So before we get to the larger picture that you have to tell with your data, I want to go to the argument that I mentioned earlier from the left, which again is also somewhat of a mainstream view, I think, among many economists, left and somewhat to the right, which is that putting inequality itself to the side, that there has been middle-class stagnation for the last 30 or 40 years. You're critical of that view. Why?
I would say I'm skeptical of it. The median wage, as a technical concept, is a very kind of slippery entity, and one can easily imagine a world in which every individual has a growing income from work, wage income over their lifetime as a result of seniority and promotions and so forth. And yet the median wage, which is constantly, and yet the median wage remains stagnant. And the reason for that would be that people at the high end, at the end of their careers, leave the workforce and retire. And people who come into the labor force as young people come in at lower wage rates. So the population, that the person who is at the median, is changing all the time. And one of the things that did happen in the United States over particularly the 80s and the 90s is that you got a great many older white male workers who retired, left the labor force, or were forced out again in the slump in the early 1980s in particular, and then again in the late 1980s. And a great many people came into the labor force, mostly in service jobs, who were younger, predominantly or more predominantly female, members of minority groups, and immigrants, all of whom are going to enter the labor force at relatively low, below average wages. And the effect of that is going to be to pull the median, which is the middle, the pay paid to the worker at the 50th percentile, the middle worker, is going to pull that to the left. So you are going to have a situation in which the median is stagnant, but it's not necessarily reflective of any individual's experience.
Yeah, I make that point about every 3 episodes of this podcast, as well as at my blog, Cafe Hayek, but it doesn't seem to dent the mainstream, nor has your critique of the standard technological change view. So I share in any frustration that you have over this.
Yeah, I don't think it's a political point, actually. I think that it just suggests that these very compact statistical representations of what's going on are not very informative.
So give us your view. How would you summarize in recent decades what's happened to the distribution of incomes in the United States based on the different pieces of work you've done?
Okay,
what's causal, and give us some, and any stylized facts too.
Sure. Let's distinguish a couple of things. One of them would be the distribution of pay, which is to say what people get in return for labor, for work hours, wages and salaries. If you will isolate that element, and that's leaving aside the component of income that doesn't come from work, that comes from asset ownership. If you just isolate the pay from work, you find that it tracks very closely to the unemployment rate. And the reason for that is that people who are, I suppose, like you and me, paid on a salary basis, our incomes don't vary very much with economic conditions. But people who are paid on an hourly basis and whose hours vary from week to week depending on economic condition are very sensitive to economic situation, and in a weak period, their weekly earnings, which is what's actually being measured, tend to fall, and in a strong period, tend to rise. And so the pay structure, as measured, which is really a structure of weekly earnings, tends to become more compressed and egalitarian when the unemployment rate is at, say, 4% or below, as it was, for example, in the late 1990s. You can see this very clearly in the data. Now, if you're looking at incomes, the picture is entirely different because the picture is governed. The inequality of incomes is governed by the contribution made by capital income, by stock options realizations and capital gains and related. Also, incomes paid by firms which are basically drawing on venture capital and paying out their the proceeds of that kind of investment to their employees in hopes of breaking into new markets. And so you have incomes which are extraordinarily concentrated in a small number of sectors and parts of the country. The financial sector is always very important because it's the source of the funds and it's earning the fees on all of this. And then whatever it happens to be financing at any given time is important. So in the late 1990s, you see this in the technology sector, and in the mid 2000s, you see this in real estate, and it shows up very clearly in the data, and it's not ambiguous about what's going on. But that income inequality, which is say driven by by capital incomes, is really reflecting the experience of a very small piece of the population. I mean, one of the things I do in the book is to isolate how many counties it would take to make this effect go away altogether, and the answer is 15.
Yeah, that's rather remarkable. And those 15 are concentrated, if I remember.
This is from 1993 to 2000, and these are the Manhattan, New York is always an important piece of the picture, and the other big piece in the 1990s is Silicon Valley and King County, Washington, Seattle. So it's as I say, looking at the data and breaking it out in this way gives you a pretty clear and unambiguous picture of what's going on.
Yeah, I found that fascinating. So let me just try to restate it. If you take 15 counties in the United States and you take them out of the data, and these counties would be from where I would summarize it as where the financial and high-tech sectors had a strong,
in the 1990s, that's right, yeah.
Had a strong role to play in employment and wages. You take those out of the data, then between 1993 and 2000, you see no change in inequality in the United States.
No change in income inequality measured between counties. Now, some counties are very large, and there are obviously increases in inequality that would still be within counties, but the component that exists between counties is a very important one, and you can isolate it in the data very easily. It tracks the overall inequality measure very well. Let's say something that's done from the census, and you can show that the extent to which incomes booked in this very small number of places are really driving the changes.
So going back to your earlier point, that was a time when unemployment was relatively low, and what was pushing the change in inequality that did exist were increases in the demand for the services of people who were really good at computers and finance, right?
Well, it's really increases in the demand. A lot of these firms never developed markets. It's really the financing of the investment of those firms and the incomes paid out from those investment flows that's driving it. The markets are developing at this point, but it's not all of these firms. In fact, perhaps even not many of them are actually making their money out of cash flow from the public.
I'm thinking the workers, though, whose skills were in demand and whose salaries were being paid accordingly because they were scarce.
If you happen to be employed, and this is a tiny number of people, if you happen to be employed by one of these emerging firms that was a favorite of Wall Street at the time, of course, people were falling all over themselves to bid for your services. But it was even better to be an owner of those companies or chief executive, because then you were participating directly in the rise of the stock prices.
Right, and that's at the very high end, presumably.
Right, sure. It's at the top, and these are people whose names we know because part of their corporate strategy was to advertise how rich they were.
Yeah, which was fine. I often like to point out that we should care about why people get really rich if we're going to worry about it at all. And somebody who gets really rich by developing a really great piece of software, or a company that makes my life better, or a basketball player I really like to watch, or a singer I enjoy listening to, is different from a Wall Street exec who perhaps has done nothing productive and has not made my life better. I would make that distinction. In that particular case, the 1990s, as I think you point out in your book, in the tech sector, there was a lot of investment made that turned out to be somewhat valuable. Some of it failed, of course, and those firms disappeared and their owners lost all their stock money, but others thrived, and the ones that thrived tended to be the ones who made the world a better place.
Up to a point. I mean, one could also argue that some thrived because they had extraordinary protection of their patents and other intellectual property, and that they managed to fight off the Justice Department's antitrust division very effectively. And again, the identity of these companies is not a secret.
Yeah.
Some of them are not that well loved by the customer community.
Which ones are you thinking of? Do you want to?
Oh, gee, just guess.
I like a lot of them. I love. I like Google. I like Apple. I probably like Cisco if I know enough about them. Intel. Some of them in the tech sector, yes, maybe not as loved as others, but
I think there's a large company up in Seattle that you haven't mentioned by name, which has at least a reputation of having an ambivalent relationship with its customers.
They're still here though, and thriving.
They are indeed. Yeah. They are indeed.
Let's look across industrial sectors, because it's a remarkable aspect of your findings that you didn't highlight. I was struck by it, and maybe I misinterpreted it, but you looked at two different eras of economic change. You looked at, I think, the 93 to 2000, then you look at 2000 to 2006 or 7, and you look across, instead of looking across space, which is what we just talked about, you look across industrial sectors, and you find that there are very large differences in how different sectors have performed.
Well, there are, of course, and after the Nasdaq bust in 2000, you can see the rise and fall of several little cycles that occur during the George W. Bush years, of which the first was driven by the wars, by the reaction to 9/11, by the invasion of Afghanistan, and eventually by the war in Iraq. And one of the things that shows up both sectorally and geographically is that this funnels money into enterprises that are closely linked to the government and in locations that are basically circle the national capital, which becomes at that point the great locus of income growth in the country. It's a very strange phenomenon for what was ostensibly a conservative Republican administration, but there it is.
Government got a lot bigger under George Bush. It
certainly did, and any country which is launching major military operations is going to experience that. And then the Iraq War is the peak of this. The first year of the Iraq War is the peak of this phenomenon, because after that the buildup doesn't go away, but it doesn't continue to get larger, and so its effect on the growth rate of the economy basically washes out after that. And what you see that carries the economy forward into 2006, 2007 is real estate. It is the construction and also the loans being made to increasingly dubious borrowers that eventually blows up in 2007, 2008.
So the data that you're looking at in those analyses is from the BEA, the Bureau of Economic Affairs.
Correct. Yeah.
And the one thing that's striking about it, I wasn't sure of the level of the data, whether it's not county. It's
county level, yes.
It is county.
County level. There are two kinds of sort of resolutions here. One is geographical at the county level, so you have you can map things out over the 3,150 counties that the country has, and the other is by sector within states, so that you can again look inside each state's boundaries at the distribution across the various economic activities in that state.
So when you're looking at this different industrial sectors, say you're looking to take one example, let's say you're looking at finance. You're looking actually at a very different kind of data than is usually used in these kind of discussions. Usually what people are looking at are individual or typically household data.
Correct.
Sometimes from tax returns, sometimes from government samples of various populations.
Usually the most of the other researchers working in this area are, as you say, either working with tax records or working with the current population survey.
But you're looking at something that's in many ways much more appealing, which is, first of all, you're not looking at wages. You're getting a very complete picture of income that goes way beyond earnings. It includes bonuses. It includes dividends. And my understanding is that it's also based on payroll. Is that correct?
Again, yes, two different kinds of data.
So let's stick with the industrial sector ones, the statewide data.
That will be payroll data.
So you have every firm, in theory, or at least a sample of firms in the state in, say, finance, based on what they pay their workers, inclusive of everything, not just wages. Correct?
That's right, yes.
Does it also include transfer payments at the statewide level?
No.
Okay, so this is I would call it compensation, although it doesn't. Yes. It does not include.
Pay is the word I use because we are looking at what the employing unit pays out.
Right. It's what's dispersed.
It's not what the individual earns, because
Correct.
An individual might have multiple sources of income, multiple jobs, plus other assets. It's not what the household earns, because the household may have multiple earners. And there's no adjustment here for household size. In other words, it is not a measure which is directly related to individual or household welfare, which is an important topic. It's not what I work on.
Right.
It's related to the structure, the payment structure of the economy, and that has a real usefulness for a lot of questions that economists have been concerned with, including the one you mentioned earlier, which is what is the role of technology. The role of technology really, if you think about it theoretically, it's about what businesses will pay for specific jobs. And if you have to approach that through, for example, what people are reporting as their incomes and tax records, or what a sample survey is reporting for household income, then you're really looking at it through a rather murky glass, because you're several layers removed from the effect of the technology on the structure of business.
And you're also often missing types of payments and benefits that are not captured by some of the data that people like to focus on, such as wages or income. I mean, you don't include, if I'm correct, you're not including vacation days. Do you think those data include health benefits, or do they only include health? I don't know what they include there.
I don't think that they include health benefits.
I would assume not.
But that's a question I'd have to double check.
But what struck me when I looked at that, and so again, to help the listeners who don't have the table in front of them, and I don't have it in front of me, but I remember it. What we're looking at here is disbursement pay, that is pay by sector, by industrial sector, across states over a period of time. So when I looked at the, say, 2000 to 2006 or 2007 changes by sector, I was struck by two things. One, I was struck by the enormous increases by sector for some of the sectors, where salaries, where pay to workers within those sectors over time doubled in a very short period of time. That's correct, right?
Yes.
Those are very large changes. You might say, well, if we go back to the pre-internet, in the heyday of the internet, it's not surprising that people who could successfully manipulate web pages and do the things that were in desperate demand, it's not surprising that those wages and salaries and incomes and benefits went up a lot. But this is across fairly wide definitions of sectors. So you list, I think, 15 high growth sectors. Is that am I remembering correctly?
I think that's right, yes. They are, however, in relation to overall employment, fairly small. And so what we're picking up is the same phenomenon that described at the geographic level, which is that the rise in inequality is really a matter of the increasing difference between a small favored sector that's experiencing a credit-driven boom, and the rest of the economy, which includes almost all the rest of us, who are going along as before with experiencing very little direct effect of this phenomenon.
But I was struck, and that's the point I wanted to raise. I was struck by, you have the last line of both these tables. One is the pre-2000 change, and one's the post-2000 change. There's a line called all other sectors. And there's huge growth in all the sectors, not compared to the top 15 or the top 8 or 6 or whatever it is that grew the most. But I was struck by how much growth there was across the economy. And I mention that again because we're often told that, nobody's benefiting from these changes except people at the top. I accept the idea that there are sectors that are benefiting a lot more than others. But I was struck by how much positive change there was across the economy as a whole outside the highest growth sectors.
Oh, yeah, I don't know what to say about those numbers. They're not that dramatic, and these are all in nominal terms, so there's no inflation adjustment here either.
That was my next question.
Yeah, the point of the tables you're looking at is to permit the reader to get some sense of what the proportionate changes were in sectors. So there was really no need to adjust them. But no, the all other sectors are both compared to the high growth sectors in these tables. They're relatively low paid, and their nominal wage growth is. Well, in both cases, you're looking at a phenomenon which is probably ordinary for a trough to peak business cycle change.
Do you have that table in front of you?
Yeah, 6.1 and 6.2 is what.
Could you just read the bottom line of those two, or say what time period they are, and give us the change?
This is 1996 to 2001, and all other sectors numbers 31,000 to 38,000. And 2003.
And that's over 25% in 5 years. It's nominal, but inflation wasn't very high then. To me.
Yeah, but it's also from a trough. Well, not a trough. Yes, close to a trough to a peak. It's a period of substantial business cycle expansion and a major drop of unemployment.
And the other one?
2003 to 2007, so roughly 39,000 to roughly 44,000. So
yeah, again,
a 10% increase over 4 years. That's 2%, 3% a year. Yeah. I don't think there's anything very remarkable about that.
Well, it is to me, just because of what we commonly hear. And I just, obviously, this is a very complicated area. There's a lot going on. There's interactions when we change one thing, we change other things that we can't hold constant. I just find it interesting how pessimistic most people are about the state of our economy, even in good times. We're not in good times now, but even in good times.
Well, let's just looking at that first table, which is 96 to 2001. This was a very strong period for labor earnings. The unemployment rate went down to below 4% for, I think, 4 consecutive years, and you had a lot of demand for hourly labor. So this was also the period when poverty rates, it's a well-known, remarkable moment of prosperity. Poverty rates for minorities declined to historic lows.
And even in that later period, the 03 to 06, which a lot of people have described it as not much of a recovery after the 01 recession, again, I think a lot of people believe was any gains that occurred in that period, they may have been temporary, obviously, because of credit issues that we're going to talk about in a sec. But it's interesting to me how big those gains are.
Well, people do experience income gains in the credit boom. I don't think anybody will look back on this 03 to 07 period as a
golden age.
As a golden age. You could make an argument for the 1990s in that there was this technological transformation going on, and we're clearly everybody was living in the backwash of that. But the 2000s, we're looking at, on the one hand, the growth of government thanks to the wars, and on the other, the impending real estate debacle. It's very hard to see permanent economic benefits from either one of those.
I agree. Let's go to the longer picture. If we go back to the to 1980, say, or even into the 70s, your suggestion then is that a lot of the changes in economic prosperity that differed across groups depended on how close you were to that credit increase of various intensities across that time period. Is that accurate for your?
Yes. There's a real change in the driving forces behind American economic growth after 1980. Before that, there is, you could argue, I think, a fairly balanced set of institutional spurs to growth, with the result that you get a growth path which is reasonably steady and has both public and private components. After 1980, we become very heavily reliant on the credit cycle, and the credit cycles become increasingly intense until you get the great debacle at the end of the last decade.
So when you say credit cycle, what do you mean?
The growth of basically of bank credit and associated private sector venture capital extensions, and with the cycle coming when the flow stops, which it did in 2000 in the tech sector and in 2007 in the real estate sector.
So do you see that? What was going on differently in the pre-1980 credit cycle then? I'm trying to understand what's different about. Is this a statement about monetary policy?
You have a stronger contribution. What?
Is this a statement about monetary policy or other things going on?
A lot of other things going on as well. Monetary policy plays a much smaller role in the 50s and 60s than it came to play in the 80s, 70s, and 80s. But in the 50s and 60s, you have first of all the growth of the public sector. You have the extension of social welfare programs in the Great Society. You have you have the Treaty of Detroit, the strong presence of collective bargaining institutions, which gave organized labor an increasing claim on resources as time went by. And you have, and then you also have the growth of private sector credit. But the things are no one of these phenomena is dominant in this period. And whereas after 1980, it's basically labor has been neutralized. Organized labor has been neutralized, so there's no further increase in collective bargaining settlements, and the welfare state. Well, it's not taken apart, but it doesn't grow except in a few isolated episodes.
Healthcare being the obvious example.
Well, the Medicare Part D under George W. Bush, for example. But fundamentally, the institutional structure isn't expanding after that, and so the locus of growth really shifts to that which is driven by the financial sector, and you can see that very clearly in the data.
So let's try to talk about that a little bit, and then let's talk about what policy issues are related to it. My sympathy with your viewpoint, which is, as you admit in the book, is not a mainstream view, but seems very consistent with the data, at least the way you gather it and work with it. The part that I'm sympathetic with is that in our profession of academic economist, the rewards to being an academic economist have gone up quite a bit since I've been a practicing economist, which is roughly since 1980. And I think you pretty much follow the same pattern as I do in terms of timing. It's about when your career started.
That's about right. Yes.
And I like to think I'm a lot more productive than I was, and I am more productive, but it's hard to understand why my skills are in such demand relative to what they would have been in a different world. I can't, and another way to take that out of the picture is to look at starting salaries in academic economics, and they've grown dramatically over the last 30 years, and it's hard 40 years, and it's hard to argue that that's because economists are much more productive. If anything, I think we're more dangerous. We are in high demand in academic life, we are part of an education system that people like to major in economics. So when I look at my own situation, I'm trying to figure out how much is due to the fact that we subsidize education in a whole bunch of different ways versus how much of it is due to the fact that we subsidize finance, a field that competes with academic economics for people to work on Wall Street. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, this gets it to a very interesting domain of American sociology, doesn't it? I think the second explanation that the economists are competing and having their salaries pulled up by the business schools, which are having their salaries pulled up by their connection to the financial sector, is certainly an important piece of the picture. There is also the fact that, having lived through this transition, it's very visible to me that in the 50s and 60s, the young population of the country had an enormous sense of security and confidence about its future, which permitted people to have a great diversity of aspirations, and that changed in the 1970s and 1980s. Insecurity went up dramatically as unemployment became a real threat, and that drove a great many people into a much more economically competitive career paths. And so you see this in the rise of economics departments in business schools, in colleges and universities. People go into them because they feel that maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, that
practical.
It's a practical way to get yourself a career that makes money.
Yeah. So should we do something about this sensitivity of incomes and compensation to the credit cycle, to monetary policy, or should we just what can be done? If anything, what should be done?
I'm inclined to favor stabilizing institutions and social insurance. Particularly when you're moving into a period of stress, the important thing is to maintain decent floors and decent and stable, secure futures for people, which means covering them from the most extreme risks. And I think that the importance of this in our present political debate really focuses on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which have been institutions which have come to define American working class, middle class life by providing basically an inalienable floor that will keep you out of extreme poverty, and has successfully done that for senior citizens and also for dependents and survivors, and providing a couple of layers of protection against medical bankruptcy and against old age related bankruptcy, and which is what Medicaid basically achieves for the middle class. Protecting those programs from what are essentially predatory attacks, efforts to restrict and limit them so that other players can cherry pick from the insurable population and make a little extra money, is an extraordinarily important political task in my view. And I would add to that, I'm very much in favor of a strong minimum wage, which should be substantially higher than it is now. And the reason for that is that it helps to set a standard for the performance of the labor market, which I think is something that we observe very clearly, particularly in the part of the country I happen to live in, is really undermined by allowing a low wage standard to prevail for workers at the low end of the scale. It's what you get is a market which becomes very insecure, very relatively unsafe, very hard to monitor and protect on safety and health standards, and causes a lot of other problems that would basically be greatly reduced if you had a much stronger minimum wage.
Well, let's talk about those two pieces, the safety net and the minimum wage. On the safety net side, so do you think means testing Social Security and Medicare, which I think would easily make them solvent for the foreseeable future. Are you against that or in favor of it?
I am very much against it. Solvency for a government program cannot be distinguished from the solvency of the government itself.
True.
So I think treating Social Security and Medicare as though they were some kind of private funds is not a reasonable approach.
Well, at their current levels, they're going to be hard to keep the promises that have been made.
Well, only if you insist upon, well, first of all, that's debatable. But secondly, if you accept the pessimistic projections, it's only if you insist that you match the payout to the FICA revenues for a very, very long period into the future. And I'm inclined to first of all say it's not necessary to do that as an economic matter, certainly, and secondly, even if you think it's the right thing to do politically, it's a problem that can be dealt with down the road. It doesn't have to. Treating those projections as though they were some kind of dire situation at the present is a clear mistake.
You don't think there's a demographic? You don't think there's a demographic problem with Social Security?
I've been in the census since 1960, when I was 8 years old, as has every other baby boomer, including you. The demographics have not. The demographics actually have become more favorable since they were addressed in the 1983 Social Security changes, because you've had more immigrants than were expected at that time. So those are not the issue.
Why are you against? Let's go back to the more fundamental question.
Means testing is a very complicated problem, particularly for elderly people, because their qualifying means, change all the time and would be adjusted to accommodate whatever the mean test standard is. So it's not. First of all, it's a cumbersome an unpleasant system, which would give people kind of variable access to Social Security and Medicare. But secondly, we have a means test in the system. We have a perfectly good one. It's called the income tax. And if you wanted people to pay into the government in relation to their means, that's what a progressive income tax achieves. There's absolutely no need to layer onto that some kind of means test for whether you have to pay, the cost of a catastrophic health incident, a traffic accident, or a heart attack or something of that nature.
But I don't need a retirement safety net, and I'm happy to have paid for my grandmother when I was younger. I don't think
you are, however, a person of great philanthropic and charitable instincts, and it's our fellow citizens should not be expected to rise to that standard, because many of them don't.
But you've also made it harder for people to take care of themselves in their old age by taking more money from them than they otherwise.
Oh no! We've got to remember that I'd study inequality. Diversity is the essence of any population. And what we have out there amongst the elderly are a great many people who don't have children who would take care of them because they don't have children at all, right, or have children who can't take care of them for one reason or another, the main one being that even in all the best will in the world, those children have children of their own who are a higher priority.
Well, I'm talking about I disagree with that for a different reason, because I think private charity would be a very good thing. But let's put that to the side. And let's ask.
We had private charity up until we relied on private charity up until the creation of the Social Security system in the 1930s, and the reality was that most old people didn't live very long. And I'm enough of an economist to believe that when you pay people to do something, they'll do more of it. And what Social Security does is to pay them to stay alive, and they're quite happy to take the money and live longer, which to my mind is just an excellent thing. I can't see why.
I don't see the causation. I don't see the causation quite as effectively as you do. But the point I was making.
Send people a check, they eat. This keeps them alive.
I don't think people died from lack of resources in 1930. I'm sorry.
Oh, sure they did.
People.
Lots of old people suffered privation right up until the 70s.
Perhaps, but we're a richer country than we were then. I don't see that. But my point is, I had a different point I was making, which is that you're taking money away from young people when they could be saving it. It's a non-trivial amount, and the Social Security system's been doing that for 70-something years, and that's made it harder for people to have. It made them more likely they'd need a safety net.
Well, again, just extending the argument I just made, there are two kinds of working people. There are people who have parents that they would otherwise support, and people who don't.
I'm talking about people supporting
I'm
themselves.
I'm in the
James.
second group. No, but hear me out. I'm in the second group. My parents have passed on. I no longer have, they were never a burden on me, but if they had been, they were no longer the case. But I still pay the payroll tax, which means I'm paying in to support
other people's
the whole
parents.
Population, everybody else's parents, which lowers the burden on everybody. It's a very reasonable system.
Well, it raises the burden on you because you have less money for your own retirement.
Well, but it lowers the burden on people who would otherwise have a significant burden. So it seems to me that it's a very fair system, which is why it's so popular.
I don't think it's fully understood. So it might be popular even if it were understood. I'm willing to accept that.
I think people do understand it. That's why they like it.
What?
I think people do understand it. That's why they like it.
What percentage of the U.S.
Social Security?
What percentage of the U.S. workforce thinks that their Social Security contributions, which I put in quotes, that come out of their paycheck every week, are put aside for them? I think it's a non-trivial number. I'm sorry. I could be wrong. I don't know the number.
That's a polling question.
It's a rhetorical question. Anyway.
It's a polling
question.
Move on. I'm not a pollster.
Let's move on to your second piece of your safety net, which is the minimum wage. So you want a higher minimum wage. How much higher? Do you have a rough idea?
$12 is my number.
Okay.
On that, I'm joined by the estimable conservative publisher of the American conservative magazine, Ron Unz.
Lucky you. Now, why do you? Is there any cost to that increase? You talked about what you thought the benefits were. Do you think there'd be any changes in employment for low-skilled workers?
Oh, yes. No, the whole point is to help change the structure of the labor market at the low end. And so, yes, for example, if you think about what would happen inside households, there would be some, let's say, teenagers presently working at the minimum wage who would leave that labor market in part because their parents would be making more money if their parents were also low-end workers. So you'd get reorganization. The real issue, which is the point of contention here, is whether this would mean a higher rate of unemployment for low-end workers. And we have now quite a lot of evidence that, somewhat perhaps counterintuitively to supply and demand trained economists, refutes that idea. A very important experiment has been carried out since 1999 in the United Kingdom, where they didn't have a minimum wage. They introduced one, and it has disappeared from political discussion in the UK because not even the most skeptical Tories think that it's caused unemployment there. It hasn't.
Well, I don't think unemployment is the right issue. I think it's employment, and I think it's the difficulty it causes for people with low skills to get the experience and the first step into the labor market. I find it strange that people who, and you may not be in this group, but people who obviously point out the eagerness with which businesses substitute capital for labor and foreign workers for American workers somehow think that that's not going to happen if we artificially raise the wage. So I don't understand. I don't accept that empirical evidence. There's a lot of evidence on the other side, and I would suggest.
Right. Let me just come back at you on the second part of that. There are two things that would go on. One is that businesses would experience increase in some of their costs on the wage side, but they would also experience customers with more money coming through the door. And my view as a matter of employment theory is that businesses hire workers when they need them. If they have more business and they're expanding, then they'll hire more people and they will pay the minimum wage. Now, on the question of bringing in foreigners,
not bringing in foreigners, moving factories overseas, all the things that have happened.
Factories, that's a tradable goods issue. Most manufacturing is so far above the minimum wage is not going to be affected by this.
No, I'm not suggesting it would be. I'm not suggesting it would be. I'm suggesting
we're looking at the overwhelming number of jobs which are service jobs, basically non-traded sector, non-movable. And the question is, would you bring in what would be the effect of a higher minimum wage on the incentive to bring low-wage immigrants into the market? The answer to that is that if you have a job which is paid decently enough so that a documented worker, a citizen or a permanent resident, will take it, then you have no incentive to bring in an undocumented immigrant to hold that job, because you couldn't pay that person a cut rate wage. And that is the reason why this is attractive to a certain type of, I think, very thoughtful and conservative, who are very concerned about about maintaining the American labor market for American workers, as that in fact it would discourage the use of brokers and shady labor contractors to bring in people to fill jobs at cut rate wages. And I think they're right about that. I think it would have that effect.
Yeah, but you missed my point. My point was that we see from lots of evidence that businesses are very willing and able to change the mix of labor to capital when capital gets relatively attractive. And when overseas workers get relatively attractive, that's part of the reason that people move factories overseas, to suggest that.
Right, but again, you're coming back to the factory issue.
There's nothing to do with the factory issue. It has to do with how firms behave. Firms are sensitive.
That's
firms are sensitive to wage rates.
I'm going to give you a different theory of how firms incorporate new technology, and I can give this were a more technical discussion and give you the references on it. But fundamentally, what firms do is they apply the established wage rate to the best technology, which may well be a labor-saving technology, but they will save money on adopting that technology, whether they're paying a relatively high or a relatively low wage to the workers that they have. There is, I think, no good reason to think that there is a kind of a flexible frontier of the textbook variety between what we'll call capital and labor. That's there's a high-level theoretical discussion around that, which I'm sure you're aware of, but I would take the position that, in fact, the wage rate is not an important determinant of whether firms move to a more advanced technology, because, in fact, they'll make money by moving to that technology, even if they're paying a relatively low wage.
Okay, well, we'll agree to disagree on that. I'm going to move on to a last topic as we're getting close to the end of time. Maybe we can find something we can agree on a little bit more easily, and that's the relationship between the government and the financial sector. We started off talking about how the financial sector has driven a good chunk of inequality, both spatially and sectorally. How much of that do you think is due to the privileges that sector has accrued, and what would you want to do about those?
A great deal of it is due to privileges asserted and conceded to the financial sector. Deregulation in the 1990s, desupervision in the 2000s, which permitted a great many practices that would have been suppressed in an earlier period and should have been suppressed. Practices that were frankly financial fraud and which have been given a legal impunity, which they did not enjoy in the 1990s. In the aftermath of the savings and loan debacle first under Reagan in the late 80s and then under the first Bush, the government prosecuted a whole spectrum of financial criminals and sent 1,000 of them to federal prison for, in some cases, extended periods of time. Nothing like that has happened in the wake of the far more severe fraudulent practices which came to dominate the financial sector in the 2000s. And so one of the most, I think, cataclysmic failures of the federal government, and I'm speaking of the present administration especially, has been its unwillingness to come to grips with the problem of the basic integrity of financial practices. And the problem there is it's a market problem. If people don't believe their financial institutions are trustworthy, they are not going to permit them to have resources over and above what is insured by the FDIC. They're going to be extremely careful. They're going to be staying much more liquid and much safer assets than they would otherwise be willing to do.
Well, I'm sorry to say that we fixed that by extending the FDIC beyond the letter of the law and by bailing out institutions that weren't covered by the FDIC. And that's
the FDIC was the best performing of the agencies in the crisis.
Agreed.
And I think Sheila Bair's book is really an excellent account of the role that it played. So I'm not. If you have deposit insurance accompanied by adequate, effective enforcement, to my mind, that's okay. It's where you have the bailout of an institution and of shareholders and of people who have capital, which was at risk, and deliberately put at risk, who are the beneficiaries of fraudulent practices. That's where you run into, I think, the deeper problem.
Well, especially the creditors of those institutions who were made whole, weren't required to take a haircut. The FDIC was one of the only institutions that did require it, and it did it, I think, in maybe one important case. But most of the time, creditors were spared, which I think has been a terrible mistake.
We can agree with that. The shareholders of insolvent banks should be they should take the loss, and then you start again with the assets that continue to retain their value.
Let's close and talk about economics as a discipline. Do you think economists have learned anything from this crisis, and what should they have learned? Because I think I know the answer to the first part.
I'm waiting for evidence. What I would have liked to see was an opening up of economics departments to a much more to a genuinely wide-ranging discussion of these issues. But so far as I'm aware, the first appointment to a so-called top department of someone who was a true dissident from the prevailing orthodoxies before the crisis has not yet occurred. The first one, so far as I'm aware. Nobody has been brought in from the cold as a result of this. And that is, it just tells you how far the management of economics is from being a true marketplace of ideas.
My guest today has been James Galbraith. James, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
A real pleasure.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.